Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to, I guess it's not the very last lecture, but it's the very last lecture with some interesting visual stuff to it. The Friday lecture is going to be all about final exam prep, which is, I don't know, a little bit more sort of businessy than artsy. So today is sort of a celebration of everything that we've done this quarter. So lecture 23, course recap. Reminder to myself, is Zoom on? Yes, is recording on. It sure seems the recording is on. Good. Next slide. As promised, a random fun thing I found on the web as I was deciding what what topic should be on the final exam, thinking through what questions we might ask. I was going to have one question that was sort of based on Aaron Reed's Subcutaneous novel. Remember, this was the novel that every time somebody buys a copy of it, there's a different variation generated. And I wanted to find something like that that was music related. And I was looking around and I found this article called Unlock the Secret Generative Music System Hidden Inside of Spotify. And I thought, Spotify has a hidden generative music system? That sounds cool. What could that possibly be referring to? And when I went to this page, I immediately noticed that the author of this post on Medium is this artist programmer who I've mentioned before, who runs the generative.fm site. I gave a little demo of that, and actually I had already been listening to it for a few hours and preparing other stuff. And he says, I'll skip most of the text, but there's this idea in most media players, there's a way of saying, oh, please shuffle the tracks. And when you get to the end of the album, just repeat it. And there's been a few authors on Spotify or who have put their albums on Spotify who have basically organized their album as a bunch of tracks that are safe to play in any order. So when you press shuffle and you press repeat and let this thing play, you'll get a different meandering tour through this thing. I'm going to close Discord so I don't get the notifications from that. If there's something really important on Discord, somebody will have to get that message to me through a different method. So let me see if I can get this to play without too much loudness. It might be loud. Okay, I can adjust your volume back down to something manageable. I found that when these videos go on the webcast, they get auto volume normalized. So this is sort of the artist has found kind of a combinatorial structure already supported by many media players, and then basically authored their stuff to fit that pre-existing structure. It would be cool, like all of you who might be creating things in software, you can create your own way of interpreting your data. But this artist is working with sort of the fixed structure supported by many media players, the shuffle and what's called shuffle and repeat functionality. So yeah, you buy the album if you want. I'll lower the sound on this one. There is a famous musician named Brian Eno. I think he might have even been the one who coined the term generative music. He did a thing a couple years ago of an album that was, completely, say, generated via procedural means, except for in order to get it published through the existing sort of music publishing infrastructure, he recorded a few fixed versions, and those are the ones that got sold. But now that it's, 2020, or this was a few years ago, he's like, let me remake that in the form of an app that when you download it on different devices, people will get different music. It's sort of better conveying the artist's intent because now the artist is in control of, at a software level, of the device that is playing back the music. And I believe the visuals you see on the screen are also generative, and they're also an interpretation of sort of like the cover art. I'm a big Brian Eno fan. Well, I don't know. There's not much to hear, but that's his style of music. That's more of, think of it as like elegant wallpaper that you leave on the wall, but you don't necessarily have to memorize the catchy tune of it. So it's sort of only recently that this artist, Brian Eno, was able to realize his vision of, I want to share this generative space with my audience. He always had to simplify it. And just, I guess, another shout out for this tool called generative.fm. This one does have volume controls. While I was making the slides for today, let's let this play. Come on, computer. Listening to this for basically an hour, or it says, I've listened to it for 42 minutes. So apparently that's how long it was. And it was just sort of something going on in the background, never quite repeating, definitely made out of things like audio files and code and so on. And the artist who made this website and this particular piece is also the one who wrote the hidden structure of generative music on Spotify. But I know that, wait, do I want to save changes? Yeah, I don't know what that is referring to. I know some of you are distracted by background music, so I'm not going to have background music playing through most of the rest of this. Meanwhile, back to these full screen slides. Here we go. So that was, as promised, the random fun thing I found on the web. Here's some important business that you may want to know, like what are the 10 things that are going to be on the final? Maybe aiming for about 10 questions, depending on the quality of the questions I can create. I would much rather have 10 high quality questions than 15, but some of them have subtle bugs in them that stress you out because you read it wrong. So my aim is for about 10 questions, but 10 on the practice and 10 on the final. The ones on the left, the green ones, are things that you already had questions pretty much exactly on this topic in both the practice and the real midterm exam. So distinguishing an empty structure, such as an empty list, from an undefined value. One is like not actually a reference to something, and the other one is a reference to a real object that exists that just happens to be empty. Maybe you should push things into it. Questions about how do push and pop and shift and unshift relate. You're probably going to answer these by running a little experiment. How to get the same effect of using a big block of JSON with a bunch of code that loops over and adds things to a data structure incrementally. You've already answered questions like this. Again, you're going to answer them through experiments. We want to make sure you do know how to loop over or sort of iterate over arrays and objects in JS. And not so much that you can memorize the ways of doing this, but you know that there are a few ways that are sometimes equivalent, sometimes not, and you'll run experiments to separate them. Over on the right side, the orange ones are some of the more difficult topics, difficult, challenging, whatever you want to call it, from the midterm. And in particular, we're going to take, if you remember from the midterm question, there was one that was like, here's 5 line segments on the screen. Does it look like a house or a campfire or the letters MT or something like that? Some of you were able to sort of wiggle through that question by doing it manually, by manually reformatting lines of code. So we're going to make sure that when that similar type question comes back, there are not 5 line segments, but 50 or something like that. And further, if you remember, there was a question about on the midterm about finding like the longest city name in a list in a giant list of lists to figure out like how big is the UI element need to be. We're going to have another one like that about crunching a big chunk of real world data, but we learned our lesson from last time. We're not going to put the data literally in the JS Fiddle site like we did last time, because some of you, your browser got really slow with scrolling. Similar to how the base code works for a lot of our programming assignments, we're going to have it load that data dynamically from another page. So you'll be able to open another tab and see what, say, 10,000 lines of a file it's looking at, but the code that processes it will be in a little page by itself without having to have a huge pile of data on top. So it'll be bigger data, but actually probably easier for you to answer. Then the red ones are sort of like the new things. After your experience in P2 and P3, you're getting very good at working with um, graph data structures where nodes refer to other nodes, sometimes by number, sometimes by name, sometimes by condition, such as what are all the things that are have their prerequisites satisfied. We'll give you some base code related to that, and you'll have to make a small change and answer a question about the change. Um, there'll be a question that's a little bit like evaluating the requires and conflicts conditions in P3. We may say, here's a little block of JSON that says this condition should be true when the player's score is greater than 7, but you need to make the code that will check if their score is literally greater than 7 using a combination of getting the fields out of objects and checking the conditions with ifs and loops and so on. And then there will be one question about efficiency. This is the thing that I said. Usually engineers are the ones that have to think about this one. And the way you're going to answer this question is through experimentation. We're going to give you a chunk of code that has a counter at some point that says this counter goes up whenever this algorithm does a meaningful chunk of work. And here's how much time it took with 10 objects on the screen. About how much time will it take with 100 objects on the screen? And if you interpret how that counter is being used, you'll be able to answer this thing by just multiplying two numbers together, but you have to kind of think through which two numbers to multiply together to do it. So you'll be answering an interactivity efficiency question in a very experimental, direct way, which is, I think, what's appropriate for this group. And my plan is not to think of any extra questions and shove them in here. Currently, it is my plan to have basically one question on every one of these topics in roughly this order. So you'll get all the green ones first in some order, then you'll get a randomization of the ones on the right, the orange and reddish ones. Are there any quick questions people have about the final exam, knowing that we're going to have an entire extra lecture on the details of it on Friday? Oh, I guess if you're typing things in the chat, I don't know if I can see that when it's full screen. Yep, people are scared of programming related questions. So I'll say all the questions are programming related, but we will endeavor to make sure they are all art related at the same time. And to yeah, to back that up, I want you to think of, and I've said this before, the final exam is not an assessment of what you know, or maybe it's not just an assessment of what you know. It's also your chance to practice the knowledge you have and actually deepen it through the practice of doing it. So you get change by taking it. It's also a way of getting feedback on what things you're really good at and which things you're not good at, because maybe you haven't thought that through, or maybe the friction of certain types of questions will give you feedback on what you should learn next. There might be things where you don't know it, but you can go learn it right then during the exam. I'm perfectly okay with that. I love it when the exam changes you. We're going to try to make it so that a bunch of the more advanced questions actually show you alternate uses of data structures and interactive media at the same time as you answering the question. Like, they're not just made ultra abstract and generic and computer sciencey. You're going to learn a little bit about, say, generative music in the moment of answering those questions. And when you do ask others for help, I hope that you'll be practicing your technical vocabulary when you ask people for help or provide it. So it's not just you say, my code doesn't work, but you can say, I'm getting a syntax error, or I'm not sure why this thing is undefined, or I have an infinite loop, but I didn't expect because I think this thing is always true. Basically practicing that technical vocabulary that's going to be the way you keep getting help for the rest of your life in the programming world, by communicating with other people who have some amount of programming experience. But overall, I hope that the final exam is a learning experience for you. It's not just a putting you through the machine to assign you a letter grade at the end type assessment thing. I think of it as kind of a programming exercise at the same time. And we have it, it's purposely not the same type of thing we've been doing all quarter, because we're trying to give you many kinds of practice. Next slide. Now that we have, let's see, how many people do we have? Not too many, but I think a lot. I'm just looking at the list of participants on Zoom, which you can't see on your screen, but I can see on mine. Some announcements, most of these went through on Canvas as well. The P4 due date was extended to just before midnight. One, because you had told us that you really don't like two things being due at the same time, and we made a reading assignment due then. And I think it's totally reasonable that you try to get some additional help from the core staff on Friday afternoon in my office hours or evening through Discord. And but we're not going to push it past Friday because we want, if you have extra energy, and I know there's so many things draining all of our energy right now. If you have extra energy for this class, I want you to save it for the practice exam, so you don't just jump into the final exam without basically having had an infinite tries preview of every type of question. Friday lab, I got a lot of questions about this through email, and we announced through Canvas this morning that there's no required lab that you have to go to for credit, which means basically all of the lab credits, you've already collected them at this point. So you know what your score is in that part. But Tiffany, the TA Tiffany, is going to be physically in the lab space if you want to get in-person support, although, you know, try not to spread the virus. And during that time, I think you might be able to get online help from Henry at the same time, but we thought it was more important to have one in-person person and one kind of digital person because some of you might be like trying to move home during that day. A thing that we've had on the syllabus since the very first day is how late can late work be? And our message on that is always you must have your late work in before 8 a.m. on Monday of finals week. And in order to make that a little bit more simple of like wondering if you're getting credit for something, we've marked the availability dates on all the assignments on Canvas to 8 a.m. So if you go to, if it's 8:15 a.m. and you think, oh, there's 2 more reading assignments that I forgot to do, you will not even be able to open the reading assignment anymore. And that's so that we know which scores are in, which are going to be counted. But for the maybe 2% of you that don't fit that thing, we are willing to make exceptions. And the major way we do that is through the process of requesting an incomplete grade. In order to sort of qualify to start the conversations about this, you should be getting at least a 50% of the course points by the end of the quarter. And you'll know that you have that. Well, you could estimate your final exam score by just plugging in your midterm exam score again. And you'll also know how many things you've missed. So if you are at or above 50% and you think you would benefit from having some time next quarter to turn in anything you've skipped or to maybe revise your past programs, you can request an incomplete. But do consider that, like, maybe you want to use an incomplete to go from an A- to an A, but not having that letter grade registered means you can't take any, basically, if you're hoping to use this class to to declare the AGPM major, they need to have your grade in. You need to have the course complete if you want to do that. And I think almost all of you are in that category. So even though I expect maybe 2 to 5% of you to ask about incompletes, there might be other reasons specifically for this group that might push that to 0%, but I'm open to it. And if you think it applies to you, usually it's a personal conversation we want to have. Start it via email, and we'll, I guess at this point, continue it via Zoom wherever we are in the world. As you can probably see, I'm at home now on lockdown mode. Okay, so let me check the time. It's awkward that the timer is up there. Most of what I'm going to be showing you in today's lecture is sort of like all the really cool things all of you as a group and sort of us as the course staff were able to kind of invent for you on the fly. I think we did a lot of amazing stuff that at the beginning of the quarter, when I was stressed out for not having had everything planned out, I'm glad I didn't have it planned out because we went in a direction that I'm happy to brag about when I talk to other faculty. So starting off with the readings, and we're just going to go one by one. I'm not going to like play all the videos, but they're just there for reference. We thought we might have more reading responses where you write things out. It's a good thing we didn't end up with more of those because we wouldn't have had the TA support to actually score them. But in this first reading, counting from 0, like a computer scientist, I guess, you told us about your background and your past experiences. And that was really useful because you are different than the people that I thought you might be. Like, I went and watched this like 3-minute video
can
um,
use games to share our own stories and experiences.
about oops, who I thought was going to be AGPM majors or pre-AGPM majors, because I know I've had a lot of AGPM majors, like when I taught CNPM 172. But I didn't know sort of the state you were in your freshman, sophomore, junior level that you're at now. And I'm glad that myself and my core staff read your words directly about you directly. In reading one, you heard from Casey Reese talking about the origins of the processing project and how that maybe a little bit died off with Java, and it's sort of continues on with P5.js that we used and a bunch more readings and programming assignments. And you also learned how to find hard evidence out of what the speakers are saying in the videos to copy and paste the things they say at particular times when you're talking to each other. Some of you are still learning that skill, and sometimes on Discord, people say, "Oh, what was your answer for number 3?" And I'm like, "No, don't talk about answers, talk about evidence." When you find evidence, there's so much less guessing. It's not that your opinions aren't interesting, but often there is evidence that gives everyone sort of sureness about what the authors, the presenters were really saying. So that for some of you was kind of your introduction to the way I do video readings. Those of you who had 5J from me in the past, I think, had already done plenty of that. Reading 2, you got introduced to Daniel, what's his name? Daniel Schiffman, who is a very talkative guy in the processing creative coding ecosystem. And several of you actually wrote and executed code as part of a reading assignment. And that is a very rare thing to have happen in other classes. And I know some of you are like, I don't want to write the code. Maybe I'll just read the documentation and make some informed guesses. And that's okay too. There were some other reading assignments where we made sure that you actually were running code, but at least when you were making guesses, it was because you were reading documentation, the same documentation that other programmers and artist programmers are using. You were reading the real stuff, answering real questions about it. Reading 3 got you reading some blog posts from Aaron Reed, who is I'll say, our hyper local artist programmer, because he got his PhD here. I think he still literally lives in Santa Cruz. I don't know if he's moved yet. But you saw him sort of saying why artist programmers complain about certain computer languages and why the friction of being an author in those languages could be so high that they would want to create their own language and all the stuff that goes around creating a new language in order to support their own authoring, not as a way to get rich or something, just to better support them as being an artist in the moment. Um, and the subcutanean book, which I mean, we already read some source code for it. Like I have you can see in the thing, the webcam, my physical copy here, which in the crush of this wild quarter, I have not even read the first page of, but we read some of the source code together. It was cool that that project was sort of evolving and actually got physically delivered this quarter. And we read some of the deepest narrative secrets right out of the source code of the project. One of the days that we are just browsing our Google Drive. Reading 4, you were starting to learn how to paint with code. Some of you had already picked up these skills from somewhere else, and other ones were like, I never combined colors with code before in this way. Because you didn't have to color things, for example, in 80K, I don't think so. But you sort of saw how it is that other artist programmers teach themselves how to use these tools. Usually for these things, there's no university class you can take that will be about just p5.js. Everyone else learns these things either from YouTube videos or trial and error, or in many cases, going to the documentation pages, seeing the examples, remixing those, seeing what else can be done with them. So you were engaged with the way everyone else learns these things out there in the real world for painting with code. For reading 4.5, I got the feeling, or for the previous ones, that when I asked you about code, some of you were just sort of guessing, some of you still sort of do that, but I really wanted to say, here's a big block of code. It does some sort of thing with numbers and math. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I want you to fix it and make it run and tell me what it does. Does anybody either on the chat or however you want to say it, does anybody know what the problem was with this bit of code? Carson says Elsa is here. Yeah, but how does Elsa being here relate to um, the code on the screen? What's the problem? Carson says, yeah, it's a
It's a
typo.
syntax error, right?
Yeah, it's a syntax error on VM113:8. Change Elsa to else. Yeah. So if I'll make this big again, right here in the middle of the screen. Wait, can people see my mouse? If I move my mouse around, can people see that? Yes. Okay. I watched one of my own webcast videos, and there was a time when I couldn't, but maybe it had to do with which program I was in or something. Anyway, so right there down there in the middle, it says Elsa instead of else. You know, everyone makes these small typos, and you might think really hard about like what math prime factorization is this thing trying to come up with when it's like, oh, just one key was different. And as you know from your experience now, a ton of your mistakes are just one little letter off. They actually have nothing to do with variables and so on. It's all just um, none of us are perfect typers, and even 99% accuracy means, you know, type 100 characters, one of them is probably wrong. Um, so yeah, you were all, you know, debugging code as part of reading assignments, which is always, I don't know, fun for me for some reason. In Blackout Poetry, you saw, you watched a video from an event called Bang Bang Con, and I forgot to announce that Bang Bang Con 2020 happened this quarter at UC Santa Cruz like 2 weeks ago, and there were a bunch of cool talks, and we probably forgot to make a reading assignment about one, but it would have been really cool to say this talk happened in the Baskin Engineering Auditorium 12 hours ago. Watch it and answer this question about code. Um, if it weren't for all the other stuff going on, we might have found one. So you got a talk video that was 1 year out of date, but the speaker, who turns out to be Isaac's housemate, is another hyperlocal artist programmer, and the code you were writing in here was generating poems. They were kind of simple, but you debugged this code to the point where it could make remixes of, was it Sphinx of Black Quartz, Judge My Vow, and it was putting the right number of stars in the right places with the right amount of randomness, in a language that at that point a lot of you had written almost no JavaScript at that point, and here you are making or editing a poetry generator in this new language. Reading 6, YAML versus JSON. It was really YAML, JSON, XML, TOML, and all these different data languages, how they're sort of similar, sort of not, how they have sort of different amounts of support for expressing hierarchical data, how you do or don't have to quote things at different times, how some of them are sort of old and trusty and other ones are sort of new and edgy or hipster, but that sometimes it takes some thinking through what makes a given language appropriate for a certain kind of authoring. Like if you have to do a bunch of dialogue text, maybe you don't want to have to put quotes everywhere. Maybe you don't want to have to put matching braces. But if you are expressing a complex data structure that has a lot of fiddly bits and not much text, a language with explicit braces may make it easier to see what matches with what. So you were learning lots of different languages, but they weren't programming languages. They were computer languages, data languages. Well, I guess JSON happens to be embedded inside of JavaScript. In reading 7, you got a taste of the weird history of JavaScript in a way that sort of suggested a potential future for it. In that you saw that there was a point in JavaScript's history where people were saying, oh, we should add types to this because it'll give us more feedback as we write code. And due to peculiarities of who was on the standards committee and who worked for which company and so on, JavaScript went in a weird direction for a decade that ignored strong types. And Adobe or Macromedia's Flash had those featured, but was sort of considered a dead end, even though it was a continuation of a more well-defined evolutional line of languages. And I kept holding up hope that we would get to do some TypeScript in this class. Oh, maybe I could sneak it into the final exam, giving where you learn just what you need in that question, but probably not. But this was it's not that these languages are set in stone. They grow new features over time. And in this class, like I hadn't done major JavaScript projects in the last few years, and this class has changed now, even in my research lab, I'm using advanced features of JavaScript that I didn't learn until I used them in the base code for your class. So it's been a learning experience for me, being sort of out of touch with modern JavaScript. And I wanted to share that history and feature with you. Reading 8, the class sort of took the direction of focusing more on interactive narrative. Not really because that was planned, but that was what we found readings on and made reading and programming assignments about, and could go deeper in, because we know that's an interest that many, but of course not all of you have. But that was an example of sort of the course going in a direction that the course wanted to go, and us just holding on to the reins. You saw how patterns of connectivity and graph data structures are put there by authors that give rise to certain audience experiences. And in some of the questions, you were thinking through, when is it better to look things up by a numerical index versus a symbolic string identifier? Computer scientists have many reasons to prefer numbers over strings in one case or another, but I wanted to give you a taste of when, as an author or as a player or as somebody working with a physical choose your own adventure book, or maybe we shouldn't call it choose your own adventure if we don't want to get sued by the choice company. But one of those twine-like things. Reading 9, this introduced you to this sort of weird-ish open source game and game Singularity. And we answered you questions that I think you might have expected that only players would be able to answer after hours and hours and hours of playing it. We asked you about the narrative and mechanics of this game you've never played. It was written in a language that you had never seen before. It turned out to be very similar to the Tamil language they used later. And you also saw that how little bits of story could be integrated with a larger ongoing simulation world by having those chunks, or in this case, it was the different technologies your AI could research, having prerequisites on other technologies or prerequisites on the game state, and as well as having effects on the game state, that when you research certain technologies, your AI character becomes more or less suspicious to the audience, to the larger society it's trying to hide from. And it sounded like a lot of you really liked reading through the sort of guts of somebody else's work out there in the public. So we had some more readings that did that. Reading 10 storylets, you read a few blog posts from Emily Short, who's a very big name in the world of interactive fiction. She has made things that you might have played, and she was a consultant to many companies. So sort of indirectly, you're playing things inspired by her. And I will note that at this point in the quarter, I didn't really know what a storylet was. The previous programming assignment had gotten sort of in that direction, and then talking to Isaac about things that he had read or that we saw on Twitter recently, we're like, yeah, we should have a reading about storylets. And then if we had a reading about storylets, oh, we should have a programming assignment about storylets because it lines up with other learning goals. So the class, again, went in this direction that wasn't planned, but that I think really worked out for us, teaching you about data structures for interactive media. And I think it got you introduced to this thing that from 2 readings later, or 3 readings later, you saw was actually sort of an out there on the cutting edge type thing that many authors are not considering. In reading 11, you got introduced to this, I don't know what to call it other than the wonderful world of tools made by small teams, solo devs, and shareware. Weird, beautiful, and experimental things to be creative in, plus an analysis on building for approachability. It was sort of all over the place, but I really wanted to share with you this world of not making fully polished AAA games that are to be sold in shrink wrap packages, but making and releasing small things that allow other people to make and share small things. For example, GB Studio, for making Game Boy games in the year 2020, can't even express all of the old Game Boy games, but it lets a huge new audience of people make things for this quirky platform that has an interesting history behind it. So I don't know if any of you want to take on making a Game Boy game for the 170 series. You might make a prototype of it in GB Studio and then hand your prototype off to the engineers on your team to say, let's go deeper. Let's do something that GB Studio can't do, but it's going to be similar to our prototype that we made in GB Studio. The big thing here is that artist programmers have this ability to reach in directions that aren't even well defined for other people if they can make their own tools. And the key to making your own tools is having enough programming in order to get stuff on the screen that you can make an interactive tool. And then either that's the thing that the tool that you use to advance your own art, or you give it away to be sort of a casual creator tool for other artists, or maybe even people just learning to code or learning to art could work with it. In reading 12, this one was the one about the ink language and the inky tool, and they have many ink named things, ink writer. For this one, we sort of tricked you into downloading and running this program that some of you may decide to use as the basis for your 170 games, or just as a way to make portfolio pieces on your own, knowing that this is a little bit different than the sort of the wide messy world of art tools. This one is a bit more professional, that was used in large scale games previously, and you can say, I learned their language and I built the things with it, and I exported a JSON file and I made my custom viewer for it, so you can have ownership of more parts of it while still building off of this thing that people are going to recognize if you mention it in your resume or your portfolio. So I hope that by tricking you into downloading this tool, some of you are going to take a few more steps. We've heard from at least one person. Dennis likes to describe himself as a writer, but not all of you are ready to call yourself an artist in one of these other mediums or media yet. Reading 13, about the freshly, at that point, released the day before, Democratic Socialism Simulator. Once again, if you know the Bernie meme that we linked to there, we asked you to read the source code of a game you've never played in a language that you've never seen before. In fact, it was a language specific to that game, to answer questions about what happens in this game, under which conditions can one thing go to another one. The fact that you could read that, and without much more work, you could have edited it, but I guess you would have to, I don't know how you would get your new data into the game. But you thought through how kind of tough topics like ideologies can be put into interactive media, or that you can make interactive media about them that get people thinking through these things. But we also liked that one was super timely in many ways. Read 14, many of you played, some of you just talked to other people who played it because you didn't get your audio set up right. An audio-based interactive narrative where there was no text on the screen at all. Audio is coming at you, you speak audio back to it, it matches your audio by converting it into text with the audio that was written for, or the text that was written for the other scenes, to give players this very auditory focused thing that was not textual, not visual, but you saw kind of behind the scenes, there's kind of a graph where pages refer to outcomes, which is sort of like choices having sort of like, I'm forgetting the vocabulary from P2, but I know, 90% of you got the reading questions right. So you did the thinking that we wanted you to. But this is another case where there's entire new different types of media for expression that will just be invented casually as artist programmers experiment with things. And then sometimes they package those in a way that somebody could come in who's just a writer or who's just an audio person and make more things in it. But it took a little bit of programming magic in order to make the platform in the first place. And it didn't take much programming magic, but a little bit. Reading 15, this was the research paper about the structure and narrative progression mechanics. And most of the confusion in this one came down to us asking questions in a poor way, but that's part of what happens when you have the first time a course is offered on a topic, and us trying to use very local and timely materials. This got you thinking through how the storylets architecture is actually much more flexible than many of the things that you might have been making in Twine for 80K, and also better ideas for how this data structure you might be authoring in YAML, JSON, TOML, how it might be integrated into a larger game system where there's, physics-based jumping mechanics, or what are the examples on the screen? An example of resource management as an in-game system in Black Closet, example of progression through task completion in Final Fantasy 15. Well, there must be a lot of Final Fantasy games, but these are ways for the kind of stories that you've been authoring in this class to build a larger narrative frame for things that might be made out of first-person shooter mechanics or physics or economies or simulations and so on. And it also kind of gave you a taste for some of the research that UC Santa Cruz is especially known for, some of our technical games research stuff. Although I'll note that the paper that you read didn't actually have any UC Santa Cruz authors. We hired one of the authors, and we might even be hiring another one. So retroactively, that will become a UC Santa Cruz paper if all goes according to plan. And those people might be very soon around to be people who teach your classes next year, maybe. Reading 16, you got the perspective of somebody who, yet another artist programmer, but this person who was a playwright and a novelist, and their take on how CSS, the way that you style web pages in the modern era, how that compares with other art forms and being sort of a suggestion for the audience experience rather than a hard prescription of exactly what every pixel is supposed to look like. And you got a sense of how the web, even though it's this very, sometimes we think of it as a very abstract or technical thing, but as an artistic medium, it kind of has a grain. There are things, it's easier to do certain things. It's harder to do other ones. Certain ones will feel more natural for your audience, in the same way that working with wood, you have to consider the grain. I do a lot of cooking, so I think about the grain of meat as you cut into it as another form of grain that you consider when you do your things. And you also got a taste of how there's elements of interactivity even in like very non-digital art forms like the joiners. Obviously, interactivity is not inherently in the realm of digital, because all of you have played and probably designed board games that are super interactive, that have rules and computation, even though there are no digital computers present, just the human computers nearby. Reading 17, I think 2 people have attempted it already. The long title is Spelling Words Expressively with Recurrent Neural Networks. Or I guess I could try to pronounce it the way it's spelled. But this is an example of something that is very recent, is basically taught nowhere in the world except for once. It was in a guest lecture in one of our classes here at UC Santa Cruz. When Alison Parrish gives guest lectures at other places. But the gist here is that you can work, in this class, you saw how to put strings together by concatenating them, and you've done that in other classes. But this idea that you might be able to stretch a string or blend a string or blur a string or do things that you would expect to be able to do with audio or with video and images, the fact that you can start to be able to do those with text is a very new thing, and I think is also very relevant for you as people who might be using data structures in interactive media. The way you might write one piece of text and then, using procedural text techniques, have it come out in a different way each time, or have one storylet play out in a way that is specific to the way that the player has customized their avatar in that game. So it's different than you just hard coding all the things that happen in all the different cases, but there's new avenues for blending and extending and even respelling it at the individual word level, the text that appears anywhere in your work. I don't know. In an ideal world, we might have had a programming assignment based on this. I don't think any class in the world has had that yet, but turns out we didn't get it. We did not get a chance to be the first. Presumably there's been master's programs at NYU where that has been an assignment, but maybe next year we'll put it in the version of this class. So that was all 17 readings. At the beginning of the quarter, we imagined that there would be 25, but strikes and viruses and everything else, 17 is pretty good. And many of them were super fresh, super local, and way outside of the realm of what I thought we would have been able to do at the beginning of the quarter. So we covered a lot of ground, and all of you, based on your answers, seem to be mostly getting the biggest ideas from these things. Oh, I can use my phone as a timer here. Cool, we got plenty of time. Um, I should say we have plenty of time. We started this lecture a little bit late because I was making these last 4 slides, and I really wish I could have put over on the right-hand side here a bunch of screenshots of your work. Maybe I will be able to do that after this lecture, just so that when I find these slides years from now, I remember what all your pictures look like. But when you were making your dioramas for P1, you were painting with code. You were making data structures that had significance to other humans. Many computer scientists can't do that. They're just like, I got my array of numbers. Apparently I didn't spell check these things either. But you made an object that contained arrays, that contained objects, that contained primitive values. Oh, I know what's happening. It's this thing that every time I hit N on my keyboard, between 0 and 3 N's come out, and it's terrible. So that was the beginning of you painting with code. P2 was you sort of, I didn't tell you what structure had to go in your YAML files. I just said, put some stuff in your YAML file that you were able to manipulate in JavaScript into the right form. And some of you found that if you design your data file format to be very similar to what you want in JavaScript, your code can be very small. Some of you decided to spell or capitalize things differently, and it took a little bit more work. But that was you designing essentially your own language for authoring. And as you also found out, in many cases, it's not too hard. But it does make it a little bit harder to get feedback from other people when you're literally writing in a slightly different language than they are. That just comes with the territory. You built multiple playable experiences. And I like seeing all the different directions the light and dark themes took for you. You authored across multiple media, and I seem to remember doing some of the grading for P2, and I think one of you had a story of receiving text messages on your phone where you had photographs, presumably from another phone, of a phone really receiving text messages, and you could decide how to respond. And I thought that was a cool, it wasn't just mixed media text and images, it was almost a capturing of an augmented reality experience where real text messages were being sent so you could take the pictures. That was cool, although I could be partially misremembering it. And many of you took the opportunity to get 14 out of 14 points to do to test out some different procedural text techniques, including the simplest of them of just having a few different options for how each bit of text is realized. And that's the way that you can sort of upgrade a static text into one that gives sort of a huge space of experiences for different audiences based on different random choices by the code. On P3, you learned in one step entirely how to step beyond things that could be done in the kind of choose your own adventure world to authoring combinatorial spaces of alternate pathways. You could have interleaving threads of storylines running in parallel. You can, of course, express all of the patterns you had read about in the readings, the sorting hat, the parallel tracks, I'm forgetting all the words now, but you can find them in the readings again if you want them. Storylets can express all those patterns and more. And even in like of the test stories, the one where you're ordering some food in the future and you can order the items in whatever order and you can check out, you can finish your ordering segmented every time. That would, even just that tiny scene would be very hard to express in something like Twine, but was somewhat natural to write in the storylets world. And on a technical front in that one, the way you made something that would check whether a requires or conflicts condition holds, from a computer scientist perspective, I would say you were implementing the interpreter for a tiny programming language that had Boolean operations in it. Maybe it didn't feel like that to you, but that's just like a different way of describing it. But deciding whether a chunk of text in your authoring language is true or false at different points in the player experience, that's a very interesting thing. Not all of you implemented all the cases of it, but I think all of you implemented enough cases in order to tell your own to tell your own kind of story, which is all you needed to do. You had to do all of them if you wanted full credit, but you get most of the credit just doing a subset of it. But from a computer science perspective, that's the kind of assignment that is like a slightly scaled down version of what people might find I don't know, in a compiler's class, CSE 140, 104 or something like that. So I bet other people would be like, you did what in that class? Um, but a lot of you figured it out, so I'm glad. P4, this is sort of me speculating that I hope by 8 a.m. on Monday of finals week, or ideally by midnight this Friday, if you want to get full credit for it, that you picked and executed a project of your own design. You pulled in JavaScript from one of our base codes, maybe found some code from someone else, maybe got some help in office hours to take it in a structurally unique direction by extending the base code. In your READMEs or your artist statement, we hope that you are showing off that you're able to do some serious reflection and professional presentation of your work, that these are not just programming assignments, but these are art pieces that you feel ownership over. And if anybody wants quick feedback on their README, if you send me an email that has like just the link to your project, and that's something I can look at on my phone, I'd be able to give you a quick like 30-second checkup on it. But please do include the link to your project so I can play it and see the rest of the project rather than just your description. And I really like that all of you have been okay with making your work in a public space on Glitch where other people can find it. They don't necessarily know who it is made by because many of you have nonsense usernames. But many of you are getting thanks for helping people on Glitch, most of your classmates. But you are already publishing your work in a place that is able to have other artists see and comment on it. That feels so much better than when you turn in stuff for a class and it just goes into a cardboard box and gets lost somewhere. There's a chance people could see your art 2 years from now, and that's a big deal. So as I approach, let's see, how many slides do I have coming up? Oh, not too many. I want to have a little aside here about this idea of you folks being artist programmers. And I'll say that in this class, we, the course staff, showed you the names and the faces and the work of a lot of artist programmers, people who think of their primary identity as artist, who, like up here, artist dash programmer, the artist with a dash of programming thrown in there on the side. And that dash programmer makes all the difference. These are not people who are like, maybe I'm more of a programmer with an artist hobby stuck in. We showed you lots of people that were artists primarily with programmer stuck in there. You saw how these people who are primarily artists were inventing new programming languages to support their own authoring. You saw how they used tiny bits of code and very simple data structures, like let's just put some objects in an array and loop over them, changing their numerical values, how that can sort of give the audience this experience of life. And we've even several times throughout the quarter dropped in on the public conversations where one artist is sharing their work, other people are responding, hey, that's cool, could you change this? What about this other thing? And even a few places directly related to this class, we participated in them. So above the top of this thread is, I showed you this a few weeks ago, I said, I sat down to make a small code example for class showing how to use ECMAScript 6 class definitions, but it turned into a partial remake of MixSage's Fisarium transport model. And it was this thing that was editable, remixable on Glitch, and people were liking it, retweeting it. And Oscar Stahlberg, who we saw, we'll briefly just check what he is sharing. Obviously, he keeps sharing his little art toys that he's making every day with new features being added to them all the time. There's even ones I haven't seen yet there. It's flocking birds. He says, oh, it's beautiful. So I'm sort of participating in this ecosystem. And other people got to the level of reading the code and they actually noticed that I bothered to use the little phi Unicode thing in there. So these are, I don't know who this person is. This is complicated bio that I can't parse all at once to easily say that they are an artist programmer, but probably an artist programmer is like, wow, how is that made? I want to see the program parts of it so I know how to make some more things like that. And yep, conversation goes on. So you've seen what a very realistic picture of who are artist programmers, how do they work, sometimes how do they make money, and how do they make and sell books and music algorithms and so on. So if there are some people who doubt, like, these mythical artist programmer things, maybe we haven't had them in the game industry for a long time, or maybe we can only hire one or two technical artists because that's all there really are. Do these artist programmers really exist? And yes, they do. And you are part of like one of the places that is creating a lot of these things, and not just people who do low level repetitive work of like, let me just make yet another particle system for the magic coming off of a magical staff, but making entire new computational media for expression, authoring works in that, and in offering those as tools for other people to download and make other things. And that is coming, in many cases, directly out of UC Santa Cruz, and several times by AGPM students, which hopefully at the end of this class, all of you are ready to turn in whatever piece of form you give to Juan to become an AGPM major, and have this future for yourself, and have really cool portfolios in one-ish to two-ish years, or three, depending on how things go, uh, for the rest of your life. So there we are, slide 33, 3:42 p.m. Perfect timing-ish. I don't know, what questions do people have at this point? And I have the Zoom chat open if you want to look at, if you want to type things there. I imagine that a lot of you are enrolled in CMPM 1 or Archie and CMPM 120 coming up. Um, uh, yeah, Felix says, yeah, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done this quarter. Yep, for this and for your other classes. We know that this is just one of several. So if there aren't other questions that I need to answer while we're in lecture mode, I will in a minute turn off the recording so that the lecture video is the usual length, and I'll get it uploaded, and then I'll have kind of informal office hours for an hour after this where you can get feedback on your artist statements or ask about code and so on. So I guess I'll stop the recording whenever I find that button. Okay, bye.